being good doesn't necessarily mean you will be a worldwide smash success. If that were true, there'd be a statue erected in my honor in the middle of Times Square. This is especially true in video games, where, let's be honest, crap is most successful. Big, steaming crap. That's what people like. Still, even knowing this, it's tragic when a truly wonderful game fails to succeed. And we're going to look at some of those tragedies today. I'm Jim Sterling from Jim Sterling. Please lick and survive. And we're doing a top 10 list because why not at this point? Here are 10 great games that deserved more success than they got. Number 1, Beyond Good and Evil. Let's start with the obvious one. Beyond Good and Evil is legendary among games that should have sold a couple million times better than it did. A wonderfully written action-adventure game with some Zelda influences and a set of remarkably affable main characters, Beyond Good and Evil is hailed as a classic but lamented as a commercial flop. Despite a compelling story-driven adventure set in a memorable and endearing world, Ubisoft pushed the game out in Christmas of 2003 to an audience that didn't buy it, leading to retailers slashing the price by 80% soon after launch. The poor performance has been blamed by creator Michael Ansel on a market that was more interested in established franchises and sequels, but Ubisoft didn't really market it very well, putting more of its publicity efforts into Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Unlike other entries on this list, BG&E at least has a sequel in the works after over a decade of teasing and non-committal hinting by the publisher, though it's set to be yet another open-world live service game in a market teeming with them, so we'll see how that goes. Oh, number 2, Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. You know what was a bloody good game? Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. An action RPG with a fantastic character progression system that allowed you to constantly experiment with building a powerful warrior. The combat was solid, the world was colourful and fun, and legendary fantasy author R.A. Salvatore worked on the backstory. While power fantasies are often dismissed as shallow experiences, there's no denying that sometimes acquiring power for power's sake is just bloody satisfying, and the player was endlessly looting and questing and getting more stuff. Reckoning was meant to be the start of a massive franchise with an MMO planned and everything, but with shady bollock merchant Kurt Schilling at the helm, the game was a disaster. The state of Rhode Island had backed the game with a $75 million loan, something developer 38 Studios couldn't pay back. Failing to sell much more than a third of the 3 million copies it needed to break even, Rhode Island Governor Lincoln Chafee dubbed the game a failure, which killed off publisher interest in the IP and left it in the hands of Rhode Island itself. THQ Nordic would acquire the rights to Kingdom of Amalur in 2018 as part of its ongoing spending spree, though EA still remains the publisher of Reckoning. It was a really good game. Really bloody good. Number 3, Margene and the Forsaken Kingdom. Margene and the Forsaken Kingdom is as charming gets. A beautiful, adorable action-adventure. Players control the thief Tepu, who is fairly weak in a fight but can rely on a giant stone behemoth called Teotl to do the heavy lifting. While the big old Margene smashes opponents, the player uses rocks to distract them or set off traps to stun them, help with comparatively weaker attacks or trigger combo moves. It's an intriguing concept in which the player acts in a more supportive role, and the combat is bolstered by some lovely environmental puzzling that makes use of a growing suite of Margene powers. It's a gorgeous game with a beautiful relationship between the two protagonists, and despite a little clunkiness, it's still one of my absolute favourites. And it's largely forgotten now because we can't keep nice things. To be fair, it was never going to be a sales hit, destined from the start to be a cult favourite at the very least, though it never really seemed to even get that much credit. But it's a beautiful game that made me smile from beginning to end, and it deserves all the recognition in the world. That game was incredible. Incredible! For God's sake. Number 4, Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. Now, Enslaved: Odyssey to the West was, very much like Margene, a gorgeous Namco Bandai published game that didn't succeed anywhere near as well as it should have. Visually stunning at the time thanks to a colourfully vibrant art style with a fast-paced combat system, amazingly animated and fluid environmental navigation, and a wonderful relationship between the main characters, Enslaved also deserves credit as one of the rare titles that manages to be an extended escort mission without being utterly bloody terrible. As Monkey, played entertainingly by Andy Serkis, Arrakis, the player must safely take his ward/kidnapper Trip across an apocalyptic world where robots rule the roost. Trip can be commanded to scan the environment for hazards, distract enemies with holograms, and otherwise use her tech skills to help the player as they bash up metal bastards with a big stick. Throw in some decent platforming, at least I liked it, and you have a game I absolutely adore. And one that flopped. Namco wanted over 1 million copies sold, but despite an initial sales report of 800,000, it actually turned out the game sold significantly less, with only 460,000 copies sold worldwide. Over its lifetime, Enslaved would crawl up to 730,000, but it was nowhere near enough to warrant further investment in the series. Namco Bandai would blame a crowded release window, a lack of visibility, and the variety of gameplay as well as its overt fantasy elements. I, however, blame God. Number 5, Gitaroo Man. A Tecmo Koei representative once told me, "Everybody loves Gitaroo Man, nobody bought Gitaroo Man." And I think about that quote a lot. It shows perfectly how an audience's vocal demands might not match up with what audiences actually want. Despite Gitaroo Man's cult hit status and the fact it's absolutely friggin' brilliant, Gitaroo Man sold like dog shit. But it's like the best rhythm action game of all time. Of all time, mind! Incredible music, a battle system where players follow tracks and smash buttons to attack and defend, and a storyline that's deliciously bonkers. Gitaroo Man is basically perfect. You fight a saxophone B-man in it, and 3 samba skeletons, and a drum and bass shark. It's one of the best games ever made in history ever, and barely anyone bought the bloody thing. I say I want games re-released on the Switch all the time, but if I had to choose any one game, it might well be this one. No game deserves infinite cracks of the whip more than Gitaroo Man. No one else might buy it, but I'd buy it every single time. Number 6, Titanfall 2. Now, Titanfall 2 was not necessarily a flop, but Electronic Arts' expectations for it, juxtaposed against how they released it, were completely ridiculous. The game sold okay, with analysts suggesting it could have sold way better had EA not stupidly decided to release it to compete with Call of Duty and its very own Battlefield 1. Yes, EA put Titanfall 2 up against another of its own games, and despite shoving it into a crowded market, the publisher foolishly expected it to shift over 9 million units. It did not achieve this. It was, however, a fantastic game, more than making up for the first Titanfall's lack of content, with an incredibly paced, brilliantly designed story campaign that featured not one dull moment, and a rock-solid multiplayer element combining wall-running shooting with big stomping mech action. It was, at least, a successful game, just one that got screwed out of doing better by its own publisher. Hopefully we get a new one, though developer Respawn has such a cash cow on its hands with Apex Legends, we are left wondering. Number 7, Battleborn. Yes, Battleborn. Gearbox has such a tarnished reputation thanks to its off-putting liar of a CEO Randy Pitchford, and as such many have been less than sympathetic toward the failure of Battleborn. A hero-based shooter that'll go down in history as the game that wasn't as good as Overwatch. But honestly, Battleborn was really quite great. With a range of diverse and plain weird characters with wildly different playstyles, game modes that drew inspiration from MOBAs and charmingly garish graphics, Battleborn was simply entertaining, and if it had enough of a player base today, I think I'd honestly choose it above Overwatch, despite Overwatch being technically a better game. It was somewhat anarchic in its combat, but with enough strategic edge to keep it from being sloppy. Unfortunately, it was a thorough washout. Overwatch completely overshadowed it, the player base fell away very soon after launch, with less than 1,000 players active after a couple months. Despite Pitchford's claims it wouldn't go free to play, it basically sorta did with a free trial mode, though that wasn't enough. By the end of 2017, a mere skeleton crew existed to keep the game barely active, with any further support evaporated. It was a bloody good game, people. A really good one. A really good one, but no one was interested. Number 8, Killer 7. Oh, I should have made that 7. Killer 7 maybe shouldn't be on this list for one reason. No matter how good it was, it's just so plain flippin' weird that it was never going to be very successful. One of Suda51's true classics, Killer 7 is a bizarre blend of action-adventure, FPS and rail shooter, as the player controls the titular Killer 7, a range of bizarre assassins that act as the split personalities of wheelchair-bound Harmon Smith. The story involves manically laughing suicide bomber skeleton-faced monsters that explode into collectible blood when shot, lucha libre hitmen with grenade launchers, and ghosts in skin-tight Zentai suits, and it doesn't really make much more sense in context either. Unique is the word when talking about Killer 7, which complemented its strange story with energetic vocal performances, and a truly one-of-a-kind approach to world navigation and combat. Sometimes unwieldy, always interesting. The fact Killer 7 never got a Wii release to take advantage of motion control is downright criminal, but, you know, it wasn't on a sales dynamo. Still, it did make it to Steam last year, and I recommend taking the wild trip. Number 9, Singularity. Singularity got a lot of criticism back in the day for not being all that innovative. In fact, the game pinched ideas liberally from other more successful first-person shooters like Half-Life and BioShock, utilising pretty much anything you can imagine from an existing FPS, right down to a gravity gun. But here's the thing. Singularity did it all really, really well. It played almost like a greatest hits of FPS tropes, offering refined gun combat from the experienced Raven Software team and an involving atmosphere with survival horror touches. Even the multiplayer, which nobody played, copied stuff from Left 4 Dead with its asymmetrical approach, but it did it all so well it didn't matter. While some dismissed it as a rip-off full of rip-off ideas, I applauded it for taking lots of established stuff, but making that stuff its own. Unfortunately, it didn't stand out enough for most people, remaining something of a cult favourite but a commercial letdown. Shame, because it's a wonderful little gem and I think many more people would have loved it. Number 10, Metal Arms Glitch in the System. Metal Arms will have aged poorly. Even at the time, it contained some levels that were just frustratingly bad and ridiculously difficult. Nonetheless, Metal Arms was a hilarious game that used the fact the enemies were robots to get away with all sorts of dismemberment, decapitation, and lots of screaming and running around in agony. Full of fun weaponry, the ability to possess enemy bots, and a sense that the developers were just having a ton of fun making it, Metal Arms sadly flopped in the sales department and the developer Swingin' Ape was not allowed to buy the rights back from Vivendi, leading to Activision now sitting on the IP with no evident interest in touching it. There were big plans for the series. I spoke to the director once who had a trilogy all mapped out, but the lack of success coupled with the publisher hoarding the rights means we'll never get more. Metal Arms released in the UK just in time for Christmas 2003, so I got my nan to give it to me as a present, and as such I have fond memories of it as a holiday game. These days it's so clunky it's hard to get into and the vehicle sections are just sent from the devil himself, but at the time I adored it, it was critically well received and it deserved a better shake. Like all the games on this list, all the lovely games that were really good that people didn't buy and they should have bought them, even though sometimes it wasn't their fault because the publishers dicked them over. But they were nice, they're all good. This is nice, Metal Arms is nice. I mean, as I say these days, just play Killer 7 and Gitaroo Man, for God's sake.